If there's one theme that we have heard from the Democratic Party over the last 8 years, incessantly and continuously and repetitiously and sanctimoniously, it is that American democracy is at grave danger. Not because of anything the Democratic Party has done, despite not exactly being world-renowned for being as democratic as possible, but instead due to Donald Trump. And we continuously hear that, even though Trump was actually already president for 4 years, that this time people are going to be put in camps, there are going to be no dissidents permitted to speak, there will be no more future elections, that he's essentially going to single-handedly destroy American democracy as we know it. Now, you would think that a party that was actually saying that would make sure that they themselves exemplify the values of democracy, the thing that they claim that they and they alone believe in and can safeguard America from the destruction of. And yet that has been anything but true. In the 2016 presidential primary, where they wanted Hillary Clinton to beat Bernie Sanders, they cheated repeatedly in order to ensure that Hillary would beat Bernie, as even Democratic Party stalwarts admit, as they had to, DNC officials had to resign when WikiLeaks revealed the extent of their cheating. In 2020, when it again looked like Bernie Sanders was going to get the nomination because he won the first 3 primaries, including in Iowa, New Hampshire, and then overwhelmingly in Nevada, as they moved to South Carolina, Barack Obama behind the scenes basically coerced and bribed and pushed everyone out of the race in order to make sure that the only establishment candidate was Joe Biden, that the votes wouldn't be split. They kept Elizabeth Warren in the race, knowing that she would split the vote with Bernie, and that meant that Joe Biden ended up the winner. And then in 2024, they basically announced at the start that there would be no primary at all. They would not facilitate a primary. They wouldn't allow any debates. The exact opposite of what a party that believes in democracy would have done the last 3 times that they had to choose their own candidate. And they were petrified of what the voters would actually decide. And so the DNC basically forced their candidates to win, even though it had nothing to do with what the people were deciding who were in the party. Now, despite that, there was a fair and legal Democratic Party primary this year. There were no legal challenges to it. Virtually no Democratic Party leader objected to what was being done. And the winner of that Democratic Party primary process, such as it was overwhelmingly one person, Joe Biden. He got close to 80 or 90% of the vote. Democrats in polls constantly said that they overwhelmingly wanted Joe Biden to get the nomination in 2024. And he ended up getting by far not only the most votes, but by far the most amount of delegates, a complete majority, enough to get the Democratic nomination. And that's how the results of the primary were described as recently as 6 months ago. Here from AP News in March of 2024, quote, President Joe Biden has won enough delegates to clinch the 2024 Democratic nomination. Quote, President Joe Biden, who took office aiming to steady a nation convulsed by the coronavirus pandemic and the January 6th insurrection, clinched a second straight Democratic nomination Tuesday. Congratulations to Joe Biden. And set up an all but certain rematch with the predecessor he blames for destabilizing the country. Can you believe how many partisan words, just by the way, are packed into and junking up what is supposed to be a news article about the two parties? Just like Joe Biden is the candidate that unified the country, that fortified the economy, that took us out of the convulsive divisions of COVID, and he's now going to run against that guy who destroyed the economy and divided America. This is a news article in AP. It goes on, quote, Biden became his party's presumptive nominee when he won enough delegates in Georgia. That pushed Biden's count past 1,968 for a majority of the delegates to the DNC in Chicago this August, where his nomination will be made official. Former President Donald Trump is expected to clinch the Republican nomination shortly. Biden, who mounted his first bid for president 37 years ago, did not face any serious Democratic challengers to his run for re-election at age 81. That's despite facing low approval ratings and a lack of voter enthusiasm for his presidency, driven in part by his age. Politico also announced the democratically victorious candidacy of Joe Biden to obtain the Democratic presidential nominee on March 12th, Biden officially clinches Democratic nomination for president. Quote, the president was always expected to be the nominee, but now he secured, quote, presumptive status. Biden's victory in Georgia on Tuesday pushed him over the delegate threshold to become the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee. Biden will be formally named the party's nominee this August. Now, you notice there's no uncertainty about it. Biden will be formally named the party's nominee this August at the Democratic convention in Chicago. Quote, Biden became the presumptive Democratic nominee by securing a majority of the 3,933 pledged delegates available during the primary process. Maryland businessman Jason Palmer is the only other individual to earn delegates to the convention so far, though 20 delegates will arrive as, quote, uncommitted following protest votes in Michigan, Minnesota, and Hawaii against Biden's handling of Israel's war against Gaza. So, at least as the Democratic Party understands democracy, there was an open, fair, and democratic primary process held, and Joe Biden prevailed as the winner because he got more votes than any other candidate from the Democratic Party voters who have the right to choose who their presidential nominee will be. And this didn't happen 3 years ago. This happened about 5 months ago. Now, there is clearly an effort on the part of not the Democratic Party voting base, but on part of the people who exercise the greatest amount of power, the tiny minority of elites, as Joe Biden now calls them. I haven't ever heard Joe Biden rage against the elites before. In fact, many people in his party who he's accused of that have gone on television to point out that Joe Biden shouldn't be hostile to the elites of his party, given that it was the elites of his party who made sure he won in 2020 by forcing out all the other candidates who might have divided the vote with him. But nonetheless, Joe Biden is now very anti-elite. And his argument is, what right do these tiny group of people, just because they have a ton of money or access to television, what right do they have to override my Democratic victory in the Democratic Party primary? And yeah, that is exactly what they're trying to do and have been doing for quite some time. Right after the debate, the New York Times on June 29th reported this, quote, major Democratic donors asked themselves what to do about Biden. So you have major Democratic donors, the billionaires who fund the Democratic Party, wondering if they should force Biden out, even though the people of the party, millions of them, voted for Joe Biden to win. Quote, some flouted interventions and wondered about how to reach Joe Biden. Others hoped the president would bow out of the race on his own. Many came to terms with the low chances that he will do so. The Democratic Party's perennially nervous donor class descended into deep unease on Friday as some of the wealthiest people in America commiserated over President Biden's weak debate performance and puzzled over what, if anything, they could do to change the course of the race. There were discussions with political advisors about arcane rules under which President Biden might be removed from the ticket against his will and replaced at or before the Democratic National Convention, according to a person familiar with the effort. In Silicon Valley, a group of mega donors, including the hedge fund manager Ron Conway and Laurene Powell Jobs, who's a multi-billionaire despite not having done much other than marry Steve Jobs and then inherit his fortune when he died, were calling, texting, and emailing one another about a situation they described as a possible catastrophe. And just by the way, now that since I mentioned Laurene Powell Jobs in a sort of negative way, I want to also congratulate her. She just closed the purchase of the most expensive home of any home in the history of San Francisco, a $70 million sprawling mansion on a hill in San Francisco that was just today, according to the Wall Street Journal. And it kind of matches her $90 million weekend house that she just bought in Malibu. She also is the owner and the principal funder of The Atlantic magazine. So this is a person deeply in touch with what average voters are concerned about, whether or not they voted for Joe Biden because they really believe he's the best candidate. And here she is with her multi-billionaire friends plotting in secret in Silicon Valley and other places about how to just get rid of the candidate that the Democratic Party voters want, who wants to be the nominee, who's not trying to get out of the race. He didn't quit In fact, he's trying not to quit, and these billionaires are meeting in secret to figure out how they can use their power to force him out. Quote, the donors wondered about whom in the Biden family they could contact to reach Jill Biden, the First Lady, who in turn could persuade her husband not to run. A Silicon Valley donor who had planned to host an intimate fundraiser featuring Mr. Biden this summer decided not to go through with the gathering because of the debate. According to a person told directly by the prospective host, another major California donor left a debate watch party early and emailed a friend with the subject line, quote, utter disaster. In group chats and hushed discussions, some wealthy Democrats floated interventions. Others hoped Mr. Biden would have an epiphany and would decide to exit the race on his own, and still more strategize about steering dollars to down-ballot candidates. The most optimistic donors wanted to wait for the polling to see the scope of the fallout. The crisis in the donor class, outlined in interviews with almost 24 donors and fundraisers, many of whom insisted on anonymity to discuss their private conversations, could not work at a worse moment for Mr. Biden. Former President Donald Trump has outraised him in each of the last 2 months, racing the president's once gaping financial advantage and opening one of his own. Now, by the way, the reason Trump was able to close the fundraising advantage that the Democrats and Biden had was because once Trump was convicted in this absurdly trivial case in Manhattan, angry Americans, outraged at the abuse of the judicial system, flooded his campaign with tens and tens of millions of dollars that enabled him to move ahead of Joe Biden. So that was the immediate reaction of the, quote, donor class. What are we going to do to get rid of this candidate that we no longer want, even though the people chose him? Not the slightest concern about, wait a minute, is there anything anti-democratic, given how constantly we depict ourselves as the defenders of democracy, about sitting here in secret with Laurene Powell Jobs and various hedge fund managers talking about how to use our massive wealth to force him out of the race? And just to be clear, the op-ed published this week in the New York Times by George Clooney, which we covered on Wednesday night, was significant, not because George Clooney is a famous actor. There are zillions of those. Remember when Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign thought they were going to win because they had Beyonce, basically every other celebrity other than Susan Sarandon, and they actually thought that they were going to put Lena Dunham front and center to talk about how important Hillary Clinton was, because that would energize young voters who just are so connected to Lena Dunham to come out and vote. The reason why George Clooney carried so much weight is not because he's an actor, it's because he's a billionaire. Because of a whiskey that he put his name on and sold. Obviously, he's been around and making tons of money in Hollywood for a long time. And he is a major, major financial player when it comes to the funding of the Democratic Party. That's why it had such significance. Because the people who rule the party of democracy, are not the voters who get manipulated into voting how the elites want. It's the people who run the party. Here we are 2 weeks later. Obviously, the concerns of these very rich donors have not been assuaged. Quite the contrary, they're more eager to get Biden out than ever. It was very notable, of course, that George Clooney is a very close friend of Barack Obama. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama have basically spent their presidency befriending the world's richest people. That's why they're very happy with their lives. I never thought Michelle Obama had any chance to come and run. Why would she? She has a life filled with nothing but complete luxury and celebrity, constantly on massive yachts in the middle of the Mediterranean because of all their billionaire friends. So it was notable that George Clooney is a major Democratic funder, but also a very close friend of President Obama. And a lot of the Obama circle, including those 4 people who host that very popular among liberals podcast, Pod Save America, have been among the leaders in trying to push Biden out of the race. Here we are 2 weeks later, though, and the donors are now getting more aggressive than ever. From the New York Times today, quote, the fallout from Biden's poor debate continues as donors are said to withhold roughly $90 million in pledges. Some major Democratic donors have told the largest pro-Biden super PAC, Future Forward, that pledges worth roughly $90 million are now on hold if President Biden remains atop the ticket, according to 2 people who have been briefed on the conversations. A Future Forward advisor would say only that the group expected contributions who had paused donations to return once the current uncertainty about the ticket was resolved. The cash freeze comes as some advisors around Mr. Biden are discussing how to persuade the president to exit the race, and as his campaign has begun to test Vice President Kamala Harris in head-to-head surveys of voters against former President Donald Trump. The number of congressional Democrats calling for Mr. Biden to step aside is growing by the day. The potential shortfall in super PAC cash comes as the campaign itself is bracing for a rough July fundraising period as major donors question Mr. Biden's viability to win in November. A leaked poll from a group closely linked with Future Forward after the debate showed that the super PAC had tested the strength of potential Biden alternatives, including Ms. Harris, Governor Gavin Newsom, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary. The poll showed that Mr. Biden had a worse overall favorability rating than all of the alternatives. Now, one question I have is, are these people just completely naive and ignorant about how politics works? When you run for president, that's when the American public really pays attention to you. And then when you are president, even more so. They know Joe Biden and Donald Trump very well because everything possible that's negative in their past have been surfaced. Remember when Donald Trump won, that's when the Hollywood Access tape suddenly surfaced. Every single thing in Donald Trump's life and in Joe Biden's have all been poured out. In contrast, that has never been done to Kamala Harris, who, believe me, has a lot of negative aspects to her past and to her character and to her ideology. So the idea that, these nice little Democrats who nobody has really ever tried to attack and destroy their reputation are running like a point ahead of Joe Biden is supposed to be persuasive when the minute any of them become the nominee, if they do, Republicans are going to pour tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into battleground states to completely destroy their reputation. But this is the kind of utterly anti-democratic scheming that is going on inside the Democratic Party. And a lot of party leaders who are very loyal to Joe Biden, especially black elected officials and black activists who typically and traditionally are most loyal to the Democratic Party leaders for purely pragmatic reasons, are starting to raise their voice and suggest that there's simply deeply undemocratic going on. Here is Simone Sanders, who used to work for Joe Biden inside the White House, who went on to MSNBC and expressed her serious concerns about the undemocratic nature of trying to push Biden out of the race.
So, Simone, if you're in that meeting right now, if you're a member of the Biden campaign and you're trying to convince these skeptical senators, hold your fire, what's your best argument?
Look, I think your best argument is there was a primary process, and you can have qualms about how open you think that process was, but there was a primary process, and Democratic voters cast their ballots for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And talking to and asking the senators in that room, have they heard from the delegates? Have they heard from the voters in their states? Because the senators, thanks to my former boss, former Senator Bernie Sanders, the senators and members of Congress, they no longer have a vote on the first ballot when it comes to convention. They're all super delegates. They are unpledged delegates, and unpledged delegates do not have a vote on the first ballot. And so I do think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the process here.
Now, she's talking there about how in 2016 there was a major controversy because all the establishment Democrats, the senators, the members of the House, were all given delegate status, what's called superdelegates. So even if Bernie Sanders had arrived at the convention with more votes than Hillary Clinton by virtue of the Democratic voting process, they had this backup plan in place that they could choose Hillary anyway because of all these Democratic Party insiders who had superdelegate status. Now, that was even too much for the Democratic Party, too anti-democratic, so they changed the rules so that these same people would still be superdelegates, but they couldn't vote on the first round of voting, only in subsequent rounds if someone didn't get a majority in the first round. But there you see Simone Sanders, a hardcore Democratic insider and MSNBC host, starting to say, look, there's something very strange here going on because whatever you want to say, there was a primary and Biden and Harris were chosen. Now, I purposely picked Simone Sanders, not because she's the only one saying this. There are really a growing number of people like her who are saying that. And as we're about to show you, people who are usually completely unquestioning of the Democratic Party who are starting to raise these concerns. I picked Simone Sanders. I just want to show you just what unabashed and limitless liars, shameless liars these people are who run the kind of swampy parts of both parties. So you just heard Simone Sanders saying, look, the reason why we can't get rid of Joe Biden is because we had a primary and he won. And she even said, look, you can quibble with how open it was or whatever, but we did have a primary. Simone Sanders, back in 2023, is the person the Democratic Party sent out to announce on Morning Joe that there would be no primary allowed, that there would be no debates, that the DNC would not facilitate a Democratic primary, that it's over before it even begins, that Joe Biden will be the nominee of the Democratic Party before a single vote was cast. Because the DNC would not permit anyone to run against Joe Biden in any kind of a meaningful way. Here's Simone Sanders. Remember, this is the same Simone Sanders now saying, we can't get Biden out because he won. The people chose him in a fair and Democratic primary. Here was Simone Sanders when asked about the people running against Joe Biden, which at the time were people like RFK Jr. polling pretty high against Biden, and Marianne Williamson. Here's what she had to say back then.
Bobby Kennedy Jr. doing well. He's at 19%. Hasn't really gotten that much out there. I mean, and I'm starting to hear more and more talk about him. Are we going to actually have a challenge here?
I'm trying not to laugh, Joe. There's not going to
Wait,
be.
can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
Do you know how many people said the same thing about Donald Trump in 2015
true.
on
Yes,
this show?
except
said
I will
the
note,
same exact thing.
Yes, because there was going to be a Republican primary. But I really think that.
Did you hear this? So she said, I have to laugh at the idea that Joe Biden's going to have any challengers. And Joe Scarborough said, well, do you remember how many people sat at this table and others and laughed at Donald Trump, and yet he ended up winning? And Simone Sanders said, yeah, there's a difference. The Republican Party allowed a primary in 2016. We, the Democrats, are not going to allow one. If you think I'm exaggerating, listen to what she said.
But I really think that the mealy-mouthed Democrats, as I like to call them, and some of my progressive friends who would like to live in a fantasy land, they need to come back to reality. Yeah. And the reality is this. The sitting president of the United States of America is a Democrat that would like to run for re-election, so much so that he has declared a re-election campaign. Right. In that case, the Democratic National Committee will not facilitate a primary process.
The Democratic National Committee will not facilitate a primary process. Even though there are other people who want to run against Joe Biden, the DNC will not allow it. They will not facilitate a primary. This is the same person now arguing that Biden can't be kicked out because he was chosen by the voters in a fair primary. Here's what she went on to say.
Campaign. Right. In that case, the Democratic National Committee will not facilitate a primary process. There will be no debate stage for Bobby Kennedy, Marianne Williamson, or anyone else to stand on.
So we're going to have another Bobby Kennedy in an empty chair in the debate, right?
There will be no debate.
Yeah, no debate.
The Democratic National Committee administers the debates, and they're not going to set up a primary process for debates for someone to challenge the head of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
I mean, do you hear that? Isn't that unbelievable? Just ignore the fact that Simone Sanders is now the one this week saying we can't push Joe Biden out because it would be anti-democratic. A lot of other people are saying that who didn't say what she said here. But just on its own, isn't it remarkable that the Democratic Party said explicitly, make no mistake, she's not like a pundit. She's a spokeswoman for the Democratic Party. She announced in advance, we're not having a primary. We will not facilitate a primary. There will be no debates. There will be no votes. There will be no primaries. Joe Biden is the nominee of the party, period. And in fact, there were certain states where the Democrats didn't even allow a ballot, like Florida. Didn't even allow people to vote. But like I said, there are other people who are very, very, very steadfastly and in a servile way loyal to Joe Biden, who are in fact making the same argument. Here is Aaron Rupert. He used to be with Vox, where he would manipulate all kinds of videos. Now he's on his own, but he has a big following among the kind of real fanatical resistance Democrats. And here he is denouncing Jon Stewart, who did a video saying Joe Biden needs to be out. And this is what he said, quote, Jon Stewart ignores that, quote, 1, there was a whole ass Democratic primary election. 2, Kamala Harris is the VP and the only Biden alternative that makes sense. 3, a Thunderdome convention would do anything but, quote, unify the party. I'm glad he had a chance to vent, though. I mean, we haven't seen Democrats fighting with one another in at least 8 years. You have to go back to the Hillary-Bernie primary. Even in 2020, when Bernie ran again, he was a very docile, controlled form of Bernie Sanders. They were all unified in how Trump was the worst Hitler. It was really in 2016 the last time they allowed there was any kind of real vibrant disagreement within the Democratic Party. And yet now you're seeing it again because so many of these people are being resentful, I would say not even unfairly or illegitimately, about the attempt by these wealthy, prominent elites to force Joe Biden out of the race, even though he was the choice of Democrats. Here's Chris Jackson, one of the same kind of Aaron Rupert people, got very kind of built his own audience, just being a fanatical, resistant Democrat. And he says, quote, the following, disenfranchising 14.5 million primary voters, that's how many people voted for Joe Biden, is a blatant attack on democracy. We cannot allow this to stand. And I do think the Democratic Party has a major problem on its hands, not only because a lot of their own, not just voters, but their own most influential partisan loyalists are starting to say, wait, I thought we were the party of democracy. This seems like the opposite of democracy. But as we'll show you in just a second, they're also now starting to say that what the Democratic Party elites are doing has a ugly racist component, an ugly racist stench to it, by trying to push Joe Biden out of the race. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.